Welcome, everyone. My name is Clara Mani. We're delighted that you've joined us for the last of our sessions in the Folk Cultures and Everyday Objects seminar series of the Design History Society. It is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my co-conspirator, Wiktoria Kijowska, who is our DHS ambassador, and indeed on behalf of Artun Özgüçner, who is the retiring communications officer, but who was also very much part of the planning and conception of these virtual seminar series proposed by DHS ambassadors. So we've walked through all kinds of different lenses through which to consider that complex relationship between the vernacular and the quotidian. The first set of sessions were looking at it through the lens of temporality, the second set of sessions last week through geographies, and this last day was really looking at ideas of placing or positioning of both folk identities and indeed ideas of the everyday. So this last session is really looking at both intellectual constructions, but also built environment constructions through which ideas of folk cultures enter into our daily experience. So we're really looking forward to a great set of presentations. And it's my enormous pleasure to hand over to Wiktoria Kijowska, who really is the muse of the project. And I just ask that those of you who aren't speaking, if you don't mind turning off your cameras, it gives a little bit more broadband energy to colleagues who have weak Wi-Fi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claire, for the introduction, and a warm welcome everyone to our last session of the seminar series. I just want to mention that if you have any comments or questions about any of the presentations, just leave them in the chat box and then we'll get to them at the very end of all of the presentations. So our first speaker today is Emily Madrigal, who is a PhD student in the history of art at the University of Virginia. She researches how art making and material-driven fabrication in the present can recast histories of artworks. She was a studio art major as an undergraduate at Princeton University, worked as a studio assistant for a sculptor, and studied at Penland School of Craft, all of which inform her understanding of technical practices. She received her MA from the Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art at the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts, where the subject of her qualifying paper was reversed pygmalions, plaster in and white Dantan's atelier paintings. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much to the DHS for organizing this panel and allowing me to speak today and present my research. So I will begin. This presentation explores an understanding of folk art in terms of the contemporary pottery practices of bandana pottery. This folk art produces a vocabulary of form resulting from local geography like terrain geology, remoteness, and community. These distinct styles and their history are continued in the present through knowledge and artistic training that is passed down by generations within a community. If craft is a material-driven method of art making, then folk art is essentially regional craft. The Blue Ridge Mountains comprise the southern section of the Appalachian Mountains and is thus also referred to mainly prior to 21st century literature as the Southern Highlands. This region has an incredibly rich history of craft production, which extends itself into the present day. Next slide, please. The drawing on the left from 1937 maps the predominant craft of each place across the Southern Highlands. A contemporary version of this map on the right shows the Blue Ridge Craft Trails, created by the Blue Ridge National Heritage Area, which charts craft museums, artist studios, and other sites people can visit during a trip to the area. A first book studying this topic, called Craft in the Southern Highlands, describes the, quote, countless eons of geologic shuffling that have left behind an unsurpassed variety of tree, plant, and mineral life in this region, home to some of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, end quote. This repository of natural resources, coupled with the isolation of the communities there from the rest of the world, notable during periods of industrial evolution, created and preserved a craft bubble. The economy of the craft production in this region, which includes pottery, weaving, metalsmithing, and woodworking, among others, developed as a way for people, primarily women, to supplement their household incomes, having neither professional education nor access to materials outside of their hometown. Over time, knowledge of making passed between neighbors and generations, developed into small societies and programs that facilitated teaching of crafts like weaving to local women, which ultimately developed into craft schools like the Penland School of Craft and the John C. Campbell Folk School, which in turn became centers of the artistic community, drawing more professional craftspeople to the region. Next slide, please. Bandana pottery is a direct product of this history and is located next to Penland School of Crafts. Bandana is comprised of the duo Michael Hunt and Naomi Daglish. They met at Penland, where they were introduced to the technique of their practice by another potter duo of the region, Douglas Rankin and Will Ruggles of Rock Creek Pottery. The defining aspect of their craft, which also happens to be the quality that most connects it to the traditions of the Southern Highlands and folk art, is their use of the local and wild clay of the region. On the left is an image of dirt they collect from the ground, which they use to make their clay. The red dirt on the left can be found near them in the mountains, and the gray dirt is settled near a creek bed further down the mountain. Next slide, please. In order to make usable clay from this dirt, they first mix the two together and then add water, which produces what is called a slip. They then pour the slip through various size screens, starting with screens that let larger particles through and gradually move towards screens with smaller openings. They then take the resulting mixture and add feldspar to it because the pure dirt is so heat resistant that it cannot vitrify. Finally, they lay this new mixture out on canvas-lined racks to dry. After this production of the clay body itself, they will then make the pots. They throw the clay on a kick wheel or hand build. They make glazes with other natural ingredients sourced in their vicinity and fire the vessels in a wood kiln. The wood they use for their kiln is also a local material. All of this takes place on their property, including the sale of the work. They have a small gallery space and a gift shop area under their studio. Thus, the entire production, from collection of materials to fabrication to sale, occurs in one place. All pottery used to be made in this self-sufficient manner due to necessity. Prior to the international production and distribution of a variety of clay bodies, each with their own firing properties, consistencies, grits, colors, and responses to glaze, potters had to adapt to the clays available to them rather than the other way around. Nowadays, clay is made to be convenient. It is made as a means to an end rather than a means of making in and of itself. Michael and Naomi evoke this history as they return to this older way of making. This clay production, however, is not straightforward, and the method I just described, pictured on this slide, details how they made the clay from dirt only after having conducted a series of tests and experiments. They didn't know the feldspar had to be added at first, nor how much. When they find new clays they want to employ, they sometimes need to add silica and sand just so that it can be worked and fired. They also had to experiment with the whole size of the screens they used to filter the dirt. Large rock particles in the dirt make the resulting clay coarser, which is much more difficult and sometimes even impossible to work with. They have to test what the biggest size particle they are able to keep in the clay mixture is. Michael and Naomi describe the clay as a limitation and the screen as a paintbrush. Many artists self-impose limitations in their practice. This often relinquishes some of the agency of making to tools, materials, and chance. The most obvious examples that come to mind here are Sol LeWitt's drawing instructions and Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages. While perhaps the larger art world wouldn't consider Michael and Naomi's work conceptual art in the same way that they might consider Sol LeWitt's, I see similarities in both art forms in terms of imposing constraints and having to be creative within these constraints. Filtering out the larger rock particles, adding silica, feldspar, sand, or a combination of the 3, and then submitting this to the fire and wood ash, alters the original colors and textures of the dirt as it first appeared in the ground. The slips and glazes they produce and apply attempt to restore these qualities to the clay in its final state. Next slide, please. For the bandana duo, it is a constant juggling act between the physical characteristics of the dirt, the chemical and technical demands of making a usable vessel, and the desire for the final work to look like the earth from which it came. Quote, "How much do we tame a clay to meet our functional expectations, and how much are we able to retain of the beautiful qualities that drew us to the wild clay in the first place?" End quote. In the pot's final state, how do you make visible the range of rock sizes in the dirt? How do you make it look wet, like the wet slab of clay you first shaped? How do you give it the reddish tones of the earth? How do you depict the non-uniform strata of sedimentary deposits? Bandana's pottery not only uses local wild clay, but also must actively make this clay retain its earthy wild appearance after altering it to make it functional. Bandana's works thus simultaneously encapsulate a truth to materials and material illusionism, like wearing a mask of one's own face. The intricacies of bandana's process of making pots give them a conceptual complexity. At the same time, this doesn't exist at odds with its status as a regional craft or folk art. In fact, they are one and the same. By being both of the earth on which they work and visually reflecting it as well, it firmly establishes itself within the folk art tradition while standing as a paradox of the idea of truth to materials and the self-imposed constraints of conceptual art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for your presentations. It was great finding out more about the making process of the pots as well. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the chat box and then we'll get to them at the very end. So our next speaker today is Artun Ozgunash, who has completed his PhD at the VNA ICA History of Design program in 2020. Since then, he has been working as a senior lecturer at the University for the Creative Arts, Contextual and Theoretical Studies School of Communications. As a design historian, his main research interests include practices of commemoration, nationalization of material culture and design resources, graphic design history, visual and print culture, and the negotiation of national consciousness between official and public design practices, materialities, and rhetoric. Since 2019, Artun has been a trustee of the Design History Society, helping to expand the field. So over to you, Artun. Oh, you're muted. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I kept checking if I was muted or not. I didn't say anything important at that time. Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you so much, Claire. This is a brilliant event, and it just feels great to be back home to the DHS. It just feels like homecoming. So what follows, we can have the same at the next slide, please. So what follows is actually a short account of the fluctuating relevance of folk cultures in the imagination of modern Turkish cultural identity from 1930s to roughly 1960s. Now, this almost always presented a paradox. The Republican reformers, the Turkish Republican reformers, relied on global modernization to counter colonialist plots and invasions. So this in itself was a proto-anti-colonialist discourse. But on the other hand, they also feared the corrosive effects of global modernization on local cultural identity. So in all their cultural endeavors, in all their cultural efforts, they aim to sort of reconcile modernity with a supposedly continuous culture. This paradox was evident in the Turkish history thesis, which was launched in 1936 by the Turkish History Society. The Turkish history thesis defined Turks as a brachycephalic white race that disseminated first civilizations from Central Asia to the Western world, beginning from the Neolithic age. So this was kind of a far-fetched historical narrative, historical postulation, which aimed to provide a cohesive and continuous national cultural narrative around a continuous ethnic identity. So it had an ethnic stress. But it also worked to justify the westernizing secular reforms by de-emphasizing the Islamic and Ottoman past, because it almost always like bypassed that Islamic past. The 1936 Kraftwerk exhibition was some kind of a cultural echo of the Turkish history thesis. It was held by the Ministry of Economy, and it presented various artifacts from textiles, metal, carpentry works to ceramics. On the state propaganda publication, the Austrian philologist Hermann Querjic said that the exhibition took the viewer, I quote, to the distant times when the craftsmanship of Central Asia had fertilized the Mediterranean and the West, end of quote. So the curatorial rhetoric of the exhibition was to kind of connect the origin of Turkishness to an ethnically continuous ancient folk essence, which was also aesthetically uncontaminated, and so it could help equate tradition with modernity, equate tradition with universal principles. Next slide, please. What is also paradoxical in this rhetoric are the kind of aesthetic contradictions oscillating between modernist and historicist paradigms. Now, in the 1930s, the national government built and presented the new national capital, Ankara, as an example of a modern city in its architecture. This is also true for the exhibition hall, where the 1936 Kraftwerk exhibition was held. As you can see in these images, the sheer constructivist lines of the exhibition hall present a break with the former revivalist historicist architectural styles and an embrace of radical modernism aesthetic, which was actually pioneered by invited Austrian architects to Ankara at that time. So what are we going to do with this huge discrepancy between the architecture of the exhibition hall, which is radically modernist, and the historicist claims of the 1936 exhibition? This is yet another example of the negotiation of global internationalism and Turkish nationalism, that the nation can be both globally modern and yet remain true to its supposed essence. It's almost like a double-faced Janus. It's looking both simultaneously into the past and into the future, which was almost symptomatic for the Republican reformers and for the Republican elite of the time in the 1930s. Next slide, please. But in the 1940s, the components of Turkish cultural identity were challenged again. The war years saw a consolidated conservatism of the Turkish state, which was exacerbated by a commitment on neutrality and on autarky. And Ankara's exhibition hall, which was designed by Şevki Balmumcuoğlu, ironically went into a metamorphosis, and it was transformed into a national opera hall. During this consolidated nationalism during the war years in the 1940s, the Turkish government started having affinities with German architects who repeatedly embraced a conservative classicism and an outright dislike of modern aesthetics. Similarly, the transformation of the exhibition hall was trusted to architect Paul Bonatz, who was known as the architect of the Third Reich in Germany. In search for manifestation of the cultural roots of the nation, the cultural roots of the nation in architecture, Bonatz dismantled the constructivist lines of the exhibition hall, and he instead surmounted the building with this stripped down Ottoman revivalist classicism that you can see in the pictures. It's the same building, it's just a readapted version. And this aesthetic conservatism was actually consonant with the war era. But despite these kind of determinist and essentialist perspectives, there were new discussions as well, a new generation of artists and thinkers, intellectuals. They started to distance themselves from the Turkish history thesis and the ethnocentrisms of the 1930s and they started to affiliate themselves with a more Western-oriented humanism in Turkey. And with their influence in the 1940s, the Ministry of Education started to translate word classics into Turkish, mostly from French and Greek literature. This movement was later to be called Blue Anatolia, or Anatolian humanism, as they stressed the Mediterranean or Aegean roots of Turkish Anatolian culture. And proponents of this sort of meta-historical cultural identity, the Bluists as they're called, they sought for a cultural identity that transcended ethnocentric definitions by defining vernacular or folk elements as a sort of a continuous thread which connected modern Turks with their pre-Ottoman or pre-Hellenic ancient past. Next slide, please. So despite its conservative aesthetics, Ankara's Opera Hall actually keepsakes an important relic of this culturally transitive period. The entrance hall of the building welcomes guests with a triptych fresco by the nation's, I guess we can say this, the nation's genius artist, painter Bedirahmi Eyüboğlu. Bedirahmi was part of a group of artists and intellectuals that supported the Blue Anatolia movement in their works. And these artists believe that all ancient cultures of Anatolia, from prehistory to present, regardless of race, they shared elements of continuity in their folk cultures. And as this cultural identity avoided Islamic Ottoman models, it could also be local and international at the same time. So looking at Bedirahmi's fresco here, the triptych, which is located at the entrance hall of the Ankara's Opera Hall, you can see such influences were already being explored by Bedirahmi as early as 1940s. This kind of idyllic renderings of the countryside sort of explore connections between modern folk tales and ancient Anatolian civilizations. In the central panel, for example, you can see a folk myth being illustrated where the Turkish folk poet with his musical instrument and his lover are imagined as mythical heroes on horseback. What is also striking is the painterly technique that Bedirahmi is using here, which is an emulation of a mosaic effect in 2 dimensions. As a student, the unveiled mosaics of Hagia Sophia astonished Bedirahmi during the restoration of the 1930s, and ever since he advocated re-establishing a connection with ancient techniques, ancient know-how. Mosaics also became an analogy for the Bluists because they were thinking that mosaics presented the national cultural identity as composed of discrepant different parts, but nonetheless wholesome and indivisible. So 10 years after the 1936 Kraftwerks exhibition, it's almost as if the building is turned inside out. In the 1936 exhibition, the venue, the shell, was a lot more modern, and the contents of the exhibit were a lot more historicist. What is happening now in 1947 is that the shell is a lot more historicist. It has become a lot more historicist, but this particular inside relic presents a much more organic and malleable definition of cultural identity. Now, folk elements are presented as material proofs of cultural continuity instead of racial continuity. Next slide, please. So this more organic and folk-inspired national modern aesthetics boomed in the 1950s. As the international style started to mushroom in Turkish cities in the 1950s, artists and architects became increasingly concerned with the sterilizing, homogenizing effects of international modernism. And to counter this effect, they integrated plastic arts with architecture to infuse a sense of abstract, stylized, cultural, national identity. We can see here, for example, in the mosaic panels of Bedirahmi, such abstract pastoral elements, farmers, peasant mothers, particularly motherhood was a theme because the country was thought to be a mother who had many offsprings, many civilizations, stylized vegetations or stylized kilim motifs. For example, on the upper left, there's a panel that stylizes the Horon folkloric dance from the Northern Sea region. This is particular because for Bluists, folkloric dances like Horon, they seem to contain similarities between the dances of Dionysus described in the tragedies of Euripides. So it was another motif to suggest cultural continuity between contemporary folklore and the nation's ancient past. These mosaic panels adorned modern public utilitarian venues like new retail centers, hotels, restaurants, bars in Istanbul, mostly in big cities, and even Turkey's National Pavilion in the 1958 Brussels Expo had a mosaic panel wall designed and executed by Bedri Rahmi. So there was a desire to inject some kind of aesthetic civic consciousness on everyday life of the citizens. Bedri Rahmi was both a protagonist and a pioneer of this movement. His ambitions were to transform all these barren facades of the international style buildings with this kind of cultural attributions. So this is, of course, another manifestation of the anxieties of Turkish designers and artists, the anxiety to reconcile international aspirations with the expression of local national culture. Sadly, Blue Anatolia humanism, this movement was trapped in a witch hunt with the communism in the 1980 coup, when Turkish national identity took a more conservative direction with the hardening of Turkish Islamist perspectives. And today, the experiments of the bluists, the intellects, as well as artists, these are seen as just another high aesthetic ideals that failed to bridge the cultural gap between modern urban populations and the supposedly genuine folk traditions. But nevertheless, I think they managed to divert the ethnocentric nationalisms of the 1930s with a new unifying literary and artistic canon that explored more organic continuities between modern nation and the folkloric traditions. So to conclude, I see Ankara's Opera House as like a contested site for aesthetic ideals, from radical modernism, Ottoman historicism, to the relevance of folk cultures in the definition of this kind of nationally circumscribed cultural identity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artem, for sharing your research with us. That was so fascinating, finding out more about the mosaics and the inside and outside kind of design of the building. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the chat box and then we'll get to them at the very end. So our next speaker is Craig Martin, who is a reader in design studies in the School of Design, Edinburgh College of Art, the University of Edinburgh. As an interdisciplinary scholar engaged with cultural geography and design studies, his research addresses the social, cultural, and spatial complexity of design. This includes informal, localized design and making practices in a range of geographical settings, from refugee communities in Burkina Faso to rural innovation in the Scottish Highlands. His work has been published in numerous journals, and his books include Shipping Container, published in 2016, and Deviant Design, The Ad Hoc, The Illicit, The Controversial, published in 2022. So over to you, Craig.
Great, thanks, Victoria. And thank you to Claire as well for the invite. Thank you to both of you and to be part of the series. It's been wonderful to see the vast range of papers being delivered. So I'm really grateful to be part of this. As Victoria mentioned, some of my previous research has dealt very much with notions of informal design and vernacular making traditions. So what I'm going to talk about today relates to some of that work in particular. The presentation this evening also forms part of a wider research project that I'm currently working on, which is called Skills for Future Living, which really looks at the value of folk knowledges and practices for what we might think of as socio-ecological futures, and particularly within the context of degrowth. But the focus, as you can see on the screen in front of you this evening, is how rural folk knowledge, traditions, and decisively for me this evening, the idea of skills are shared geographically, intergenerationally, and cross-culturally. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So actually, I'm talking about a region which is very similar to, very close to where Emily was discussing. So there's a nice synergy between the two papers already. And I'm going to be talking today about the Foxfire Museum and Heritage Centre, which is in the Appalachian region of rural North Georgia. So actually part of the Blue Ridge Mountains that Emily mentioned. The Heritage Centre itself was set up in 1974. And like other sort of rural schools in the area and across that region, was really heavily involved, and still is, in teaching a range of different skills common to the region. So the centre, as it still stands, has a range of different outlets for skills such as flint knapping, through to larger scale constructions that you can see in this archival photograph here, which is log cabin constructions. But most importantly, and what I'm going to talk about primarily, is Foxfire magazine. So this was actually established in 1966. The centre itself followed in 1974. And the magazine was set up by a school teacher in the region called Elliot Wigington. So in 1966, he encouraged his pupils to start a magazine, which primarily was originally to develop their writing and research skills, but ultimately became a really important conduit for the capturing of rural knowledge in this region and the dissemination of that knowledge as well. So a key remit, of Foxfire at its inception was to record and capture the traditions and skills of the older members of this community, or what are known as, in this area and others, old-timer ways. So part of this was concerned with the preservation of these skills and knowledge, so they would not become lost to future generations. So sort of moving beyond a purely oral tradition of sharing knowledge into capturing that through text and image. But decisively for what interests me this evening is how these skills were shared through the magazine itself. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So I'd like to just briefly talk a little bit more about the origins of Foxfire in terms of the work of the school children in establishing the magazine. So the children, as part of this, had developed a series of research techniques, so using interviews, visual research methods to gather the information from the people in this region, but also then taking that forward into writing, editing, and then ultimately publishing Foxfire magazine. And then Foxfire magazine has then been created into a series of books as well, so the best of individual magazines captured in the books themselves. So for me, one of the key things is that the magazine itself, and subsequently the books, can be seen as a vital mechanism for recording first-hand experiences of folk cultures such as music, such as cooking or poetry, as well as, importantly for us, I think, is the craft and making traditions of the region as well. Crucially, Foxfire magazine is what I term a distributed object, but also a distributed archive itself. So as a distributed object in its own right, it disseminates the situated, place-based folk knowledge of this geographical region to a national, and particularly through the book series, an international audience. So in this sense, we might think of the magazine as a distributed archive, as I say. One that is based in North Georgia, but reaches far beyond the specific encounters between place and knowledge. And you can see here just in the background, and apologies about the interruption of the slides there, these are just a couple of issues, one from 1975 and one from spring 1979. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So in documenting the folk cultures of the region, many of the early editions of the magazine often focused on poetry, for example. They focused on song lyrics from the region. But it was actually latterly, so from about the 1970s onwards, that what were known as the how-to sections became increasingly important. And it's this aspect of the magazine that particularly interests me, so notably the instructional qualities of how these rural traditions and practices were imparted. So using a range of ethnographic approaches, and particularly visual ethnography, the school children who worked on producing and recording and researching the magazine rigorously documented a huge range of case studies. So the example I just have on the screen in front of you is the example is a wooden wagon. And what's important for me is actually how the magazine documents the actual research process that the school children undertook. And it's probably very difficult for people to see on the screen. But on the left-hand image in the bottom right, there is a photo of one of the school children who is actually drawing the wagon, so to record that. For me, and this is where I wanted to show the two images here, decisively there's a move beyond purely photographic recording to the creation of really highly sophisticated technical drawings. So the image on the right here shows the shaft of the wooden wagon, and actually clearly sort of provides really incredibly detailed instructions and measurements on how to reconstruct the shaft assembly of the wagon. So for me, the instructional qualities of these drawings are the critical elements for recording and considering the immense value of the magazine itself. So they offer the opportunity for the knowledge and practices of these previous generations to be re-established today. So in some ways, this is why I asked the question at the end here. So it's just a sort of postulation to put out there. So really, I asked the question as to whether Foxfire magazine itself could be seen as a folk object. And by that, I mean it's a repository of knowledge of this particular region at this particular time. So in the sense we might think about an archaeological object of some sort as a document, as a record of a particular moment in time. I like to think, and well, again, I'm sort of thinking about this question really, is whether Foxfire magazine itself could be seen in that sense. So if we could just have the final slide, please. So just to bring this to a conclusion, and I'm really curious to see and hear what other people think about some of these ideas. So whilst the Foxfire Museum and Heritage Centre itself offers incredibly valuable access to hands-on skills and traditions in the North Georgia region, what particularly interests me is how the magazine extends the geographical reach of these traditions. So this is why I refer to Foxfire magazine as a distributed archive. So how these skills are disseminated beyond the immediate place of this area of North Georgia. So as a result, we see distinct forms of cross-cultural knowledge being shared. So for example, how this particular region of the Blue Ridge Mountains relates to other non-US based traditions, for example. So thinking about this in cross-cultural terms. But also crucially for me is about the intergenerational dimensions of folk knowledge. So as a distributed archive, it also extends across time. So how contemporary generations of school children think about their grandparents or great-grandparents' traditions within this region, and also how the intergenerational ideas of the school children documenting these traditions can be shared across time as well. But in particular, it's the instructional qualities of the photographs and technical drawings that are of particular interest to me, and then crucially how these folk traditions can be kept alive. So that's where I talk about these as a repository of potential, so how we might think about learning lessons from the past and learning through these instructional qualities. And finally, and returning to one of my opening points, I believe that these traditions captured throughout the magazines move beyond a purely sort of heritage practice into a space where folk skills have the potential to be deployed in the context of socio-ecological futures. So how we might think about learning from these traditions to live in the times of the climate emergency, for example. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Once again, such an interesting topic, and it was interesting to find how those craft and folk kind of skills have been documented over the years. So if you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the chat box. And as I said before, we'll get to them at the very end. So our final speaker today and final speaker of the series is Claire Le Thomas, who works with an interdisciplinary approach, art history, anthropological history, art anthropology, cultural history, and visual studies on DIY artistic practices and intersection between high and low, art and mass culture in the avant-garde history. She taught in Paris, Used and Strasbourg University, wrote for the website Histoire pour la Mâche, which is a resource for secondary school teachers, and directed a research program for the Musée Éclat de la Presqu'île de Cannes. In 2013, she is the author of numerous publications on Cubism, college historiography, ordinary creative practices, and DIY. Her latest research focuses on decorative house painters. So sorry about mispronouncing the words, but over to you, Clay.
Do you hear me? And do we have the video? You hear me?
Yeah,
It's okay?
yeah, we can
Okay.
hear you fine.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'll begin. Okay. I'll be reading because my English is not fluent enough for having a presentation just talking. With the growing of consumption and mass culture, a new form of craft arose in the urban world, amateur occupation or ordinary creative practice. These leisure activities, which were done inside home or at immediate proximity, consisted in making usual or decorative objects. Can I have the next slide, please? Such as frames made of carven wood or assembled pine cones and herbs, richly decorated jewel or candy boxes with silk, embossed or gold paper, flower pot holder, lampshade or folding screen ornamented with drawing or glued pictures, or rabbit hutch. In other terms, to use present-day expression, they belong to DIY and creative hobbies, which were growing fast during the last third of the 19th century in France, but not only in France. This period is indeed well known for its taste for decor and its over-decorated architecture. One only needs to think about eclecticism. But this taste for decor also spread to the entire society. Interiors were congested with furniture and objects. As a consequence, people crafted more and more objects, and to support this practice, new mass products were created. Can I have the next slide, please? Ready-made objects to ornate with paint, engraving, papers that were sold in art and craft shops, and numerous handbooks to help beginners. I would like first to present the characteristic of this domestic occupation, their goals, predilection, material, techniques, before considering their affiliation to folk art. Ordinary crafters' first ambition was a beautifying and well-being goal. Can I have the next slide, please? They aimed to, I quote, maintain in good condition one's home, ornate your home with your own hands, in order to get more comfort, more well-being, to quote the handbook of the time. By well-being, we must understand to give a sense of intimacy, to adapt domestic interior to oneself. But they were also driven by the desire of creating with one's own hands. I quote, everyone wants to create and show his work. We want to spend our time creating objects that make a mark and carry our name by the slight work we do on small, useful, or only pleasant objects accredited by fashion and that we offer as souvenir, end of quote. Making handmade objects was thus a means to single out oneself and customize one's home to show the owner taste or personality. It met, consequently, the recent importance gave to home. However, there was also a financial reason to domestic creative practice, as handiwork, I quote, offers the easiest and cheaper manner to set up house and to make or repair all the little things that are so easy to do, but so expensive when paying for, end of quote. The activities then also included fixing straw seats, hiding furniture wear and defects, or embellish ordinary items, crafting objects instead of buying them, like a nutshell toy boat or a terracotta vase, or creating fake for unaffordable objects such as fake Japanese porcelain. The latest is made of cut pattern from fabric glued on a vase and varnished. Therefore, because of the double craft and financial constraint, they made the most of cheap, ordinary or reused material, wood, cardboard, wool, nail, glue. They create flower out of beach cell, crack, brick mosaic from broken dishes, rustic frames from recovered plants. Furthermore, to solve the maker's lack of skill, creation processes were simplified. Most often, crafting consisted in pasting or putting together ready-made forms, such as natural items, dried leaves, flowers, nuts, insects, printed work, cut out image from various mediums, books, advertisement, models, fabrics, factory-made objects, vase, boxes, stencil, mold ornaments sold in store. Hence, domestic crafting was fully involved in the production of everyday objects. Not only it was devoted to designing the living space, especially improving its use and decoration, but it was mainly engaged in handmade, creating usual and familiar items. Moreover, when looking closely to this practice, they appear to come with merchandising products. They were the starting point for commodification of creative leisure through the selling of mass-produced supplies and goods. How, thus, can we relate this domestic creative practice to folk art? First, one must come back to folk art's definition. If folk art, in the broader sense, refers to the art of the people as distinguished from the elite, the professional products or high art, then ordinary creative practice need to be included in this artistic category. Indeed, domestic crafters didn't create an art or craft work, as there were no artists, not artists or craftsmen, but ordinary people who didn't possess the cultural, technical, or stylistic background of these trades. As a result, they didn't fit in the art or craft world as characterized by Howard Becker. To follow Becker's classification, ordinary crafters belonged more to the naive art category. They worked alone, without following any artistic, technical, or aesthetical convention, and for that reason, didn't really participate to any cooperation networks of making, broadcasting, accreditation, critique. Nevertheless, naive artists were regularly included in folk art books and galleries, precisely for the reason evoked below, and consequently have a place in folk historiography. This merger is not without basis when having a closer look at the roots of domestic creative occupation. They were not only linked to the 19th and 20th century leisure democratization, but they were also here to traditional crafting and rural practice. One of the major sources to understand domestic crafting is the handbooks published to help beginners embracing creative leisure. This literature, which explained in detail tools, techniques, or material needed and gave step-by-step hints to realize a specific object, a vase, a painting, a frame. So this literature mostly suggested to reader traditional manual crafting, such as basketry, pottery, carpentry, faience painting, iron work, or rural self-sufficiency practice, like making furniture, fence, racks. Moreover, among the items put forward for making, some sprung from folk tradition. Can I have the next slide, please? Miniature vase in eggshell and cardboard handle, for example, on the right, recall a Dinan's tradition, just like filigree flower hairpin, which were a Bretagne custom, or shell flowers, which resemble shell objects from Ille-et-Vilaine. In other terms, domestic creative practice perpetuated vanishing tradition and therefore can be tied to the rediscovery of manual crafting that occurs at the same time, precisely through, among other phenomena, the birth of the folk art research field and category. Hence, the rising of creative leisure can be seen as a consequence of industrial revolution and the increasing urban society. On the one hand, these practices were a means to stand against industrialization and its effects, works disqualification and objects depersonalization and anonymity, as Véronique Moulinier proved for contemporary workers. Ordinary crafters found a way to keep alive unused skill and to maintain unique creation. On the other hand, in the context of rural migration, domestic crafting transformed all the regional and rural practice to adapt them to an urban environment and a new deconsumption society. The relationship networks in which ordinary creative practice are embedded support this analysis of creative leisure as a new urban folk form. Ordinary crafters were not only lonely creators making for themselves. Can I have the next slide, please? Their creations were done to be seen and shared. They were shown, offered to friends, family, neighbors, building a social and interpersonal networks, just as folk art. Hair canvases, for example, is, I quote, all my quotations are from handbooks of the time. So, hair canvases is the most precious gift from a beloved one, or by self-making, one offers a gift that carries for your friend obliging eyes the tremendous value of being the work of your hands. To conclude, ordinary creative practice stand at the intersection of folk form with the new urban, industrial, and consumption society. They joined traditional manner of self-making with reuse and close-at-hand material to mass production commodities, affecting thereby their appearance, signification, and mediation. This translation occurred through the design of everyday objects as they invoke creating useful items and are tied with new industrial goods. It is precisely this adaptation that prevented ethnology and folk studies to include domestic crafting in this artistic category, even though they were very close to folk art in terms of time concordance, crafting population, or material techniques and iconography. Indeed, ethnology and folk study arose collecting and analyzing crafted objects during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the precise moment when domestic creative practice appeared and grew. But while inventing the folk art category of art et tradition populaire in France, they left unstudied ordinary crafting because it did not fit the restrictive definition of folk art of the time. As they were not part of a cultural collective tradition located within a precise geographical area, they could not be used as testimony for a peculiar culture. Thank you.